Thank you, Jonathan. Excellent. Let me now move on to Professor Dongsheng Shi, joining us from Beijing. Dongsheng, welcome.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, so I will start. Thank you very much for having me here, and it's a great honor to share with you some of my observations about this topic, the new geopolitical order. Can you see the slides now? Sorry. Especially, I'm very happy that I see some familiar friends, the name of familiar friends in our audience, like Mr. Warren Coates, one of my old friend from United States. Thank you. So the topic is the new geopolitical order in the post-pandemic era. Actually, the last one I sent it to the organizer of this conference is the geopolitical order in the post-pandemic and post-Trump era. But now it seems it's not necessary post Mr. Trump. Okay. So I will talk about three parts: the political influence of the pandemic, the end of the new liberal globalization, and the power configuration of today's world order. So the first one, the political influence of the coronavirus pandemic, the geopolitical effect of the pandemic seems like a third world war. It's very similar to a world war. It speeds up the pace of the world powers structure adjustment. China was the first one caught surprised by the COVID-19, but okay. But thanks to this, its up-down mobilization capability, its handling of the crisis was relatively successful. Cooperation of the whole with the cooperation of the whole society, reliance on science and technologies. So today, Chinese economy may be the only, the highest growth large economy in the world this year. And the US had more time to prepare for the pandemic, while it, especially this presidency, failed in saving lives domestically, nor provide the world with global leadership or international public goods. If the Chinese vaccine in the coming 1 or 2 years, Chinese vaccine as a President Xi Jinping defined as a global public goods being provided cheaply to save the world in the coming years, it will be both symbolic and a substantial inauguration of China's global legitimate leadership, which will be a very tough competition for the United States. Then the second thing I would like to address is the world may rethink about the indispensable role of the government. During the Cold War, the US system emphasized, United States of America emphasized bottom-up political economic governance, which is market economy and democracy, while the Soviet Union was good at top-bottom social control and mobilization. China learned first from Soviet Union, especially in the 1950s, and the United States in the 1980s and 1990s and the 2000s, which made it a mixed blood and enjoys a comparative advantage of both sides, both are two empires. A powerful and capable state and an active and competitive market economy. To deal with this pandemic, the most effective way is to make all your citizens stay home for 14 days at the same time. It will disappear like a miracle, as President Donald Trump puts it always. Let's suppose if North Korea caught surprised by the COVID-19, I believe Mr. Jin would deal with it very smoothly, because he could make all his citizens stay at home for 14 days at the same time. But that's against the value and belief of the Western societies. The pandemic may again remind the whole world about the necessity of strong government and a wartime mobilization system. So then come to the globalization. Yeah, we talked about the liberalism idea, but then come to the neoliberalism globalization. In fact, if we look at the PIIE so-called globalization chart, we can see since 1870 to 1914, it was a period of globalization proposed by the Great Britain at its powerful height. And since 1914 to 1945, it was a deglobalization, which was interwar area. Then after the Second World War, there was a there was two parallel systems. One is dominated by the United States, one is about the Soviet Union and its allies. Then after the 1980s, we have a real liberalization, which was the new liberalism globalization that we talk about today. But if we look at the data, the global trade divided by GDP index, it has been steadily going down since then, since 2008. Then I make the similar chart, which this is a blue line. The blue line is exactly what the PIIE chart showed. And I extended to early this year, to the first half of this year, 2020. And we can see the COVID-19 is hurting global trade more than hurting the domestic GDPs. So which makes this index going down dramatically. And more important, if we look at the red line, the red one is about the global value chain trade. And in fact, after 2008, the global value chain trade is also shrinking comparing to GDP. There's another index, another two indexes, which is more about, not about trade, but about the capital. The blue line is about the FDI capital, which means they really run some factories or some stores. That peaked in 2008. And more importantly, that's something that produced by myself, invented by myself. That green line talks about each dollar of the money base created by the central banks globally, how much more dollars it could derive in the international lending. So if we look at the green line, it shows the international lending is also relatively shrinking after 2008. So that answers the question about the about whether the globalization is going on or not. Okay, so I have been quite pessimistic since 2009, especially after 2010. I wrote some papers, gave some speeches about the ending of the globalization. You know, we all talk about President Donald Trump, his trade wars against China, against its allies. But behind that, deep under these phenomena, is a demographic, is economic, technological, and geopolitical structure change that created these peak at 2008. And after that, the globalization have been shrinking. So finally, we come to a topic of the Sino-US power configuration. So this figure talks about if we take US GDP, United States GDP as 100% and go along the timeline, and we can see its challenges, how challenges is close to the size of the US economy. We can see this one, the first one is Soviet Union. Can you see my mouse? The Soviet Union and Russia. Okay, at its peak, the Soviet Union's power occupies nearly 50% of the US economy. And then after collapse of the Soviet Union, it's no longer meaningful economy. Okay, And then we have Japan. At its peak in 1995, it occupies 70, more than 72, around 72 of the US economy. Then, because of slow growth and aging society, this economy is shrinking relatively. Then we have another group of states together. It's called Eurozone. Eurozone is not one economy, one country, but a group of the economies together, sharing one currency, but not the same fiscal budget. So put them together, it occupies less than, it has stabilized around 80% of the US economy in the history, in the past more than half century. Then we have the nearest very recent challenger, it's China. Because of the success in handling the pandemic, China is going to reach 75 US economy size this year in 2020. It will reach around $15.22 trillion this year, by end of this year, and which is a new height since 1880s.
I think we might have lost him. Let me give some time. Can you hear us? No? Oh. Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Why don't hopefully we will get Dongsheng back to the screen. Maybe we can kick off.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
Here we are.
Hello?
Yes.
I felt that I was out of the chat room. Yeah.
We lost you for 1 minute. Yes.
Pardon?
We lost your voice for 1 minute.
Okay. Only for 1 minute.
Yeah. Yes. But please, if you can conclude your presentation, so we can go to maybe to Q&A.
Okay. I will conclude. I will conclude very briefly.
Sure.
So should I the last figure that I want to show you? Okay.
Yeah, please, if you can.
Okay. Okay.
Good.
Good. Okay. And what is going on is China is being squeezed out from the US-centered world market system. And you know, when China joined the WTO, China was a relatively small economy. It's going around the United States. It's exporting everything to the United States. But now China is a relatively, much bigger than before. And it's also attracting some other nations around him to play as a big market. And United States, frightened by the TPP, tariff trade war, and chips embargo, China has no other choices but building a self-centered market system, including the BRI, the Renminbi internationalization, and the so-called Made in China 2025 and the Vision 2035 very recently. So that to conclude my argument, I believe back in 1970s, United States and China were strategic partners in fighting against the former Soviet Union. And then it was a master-servant relationship in creating globalization bubble. And since 2012, or especially after 2016, US-China relationship has already been reloaded to a confrontational and mutual suspicious track, especially by Mr. Trump's audacious and destructive policies. So in the future, to stabilize the global strategic order, I believe there should be some triangle relations. Yeah, for example, on economics, there should be a US, China, and the European triangle economic and trade and financial system. And on security and politics, it should be US, China, and Russia triangle relations. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. I'm going to open the floor for questions and answers, but maybe I can take the privilege as a moderator of these sessions, maybe to ask to all of the panelists. It seems to me that there was some convergence clearly that multilateralism is really under stress. This morning, one of our panelists mentioned, that an alternative to multilateralism as we knew it would be maybe a group of countries, or what they call alliance of multilateralists, meaning a couple of countries would be able, to get together and create ad hoc agreement. So do you see as an alternative to the multilateralism as we knew it and all the underpinning of the international financial institutions, the IMF, World Bank, WTO, that countries might go to an alternative and can group ad hoc alliances? That's number one. And a feeling that you see that the decoupling of US-China relations will be accelerated, whatever the next administration will be. And maybe for Jonathan in Europe and George, I did recall that the European Commission called China a systemic rival for global governance. Do you see that there is also in Europe rethinking about China-Europe relations? And if this is the case, what might be the underpinnings of it? But whatever wants to take the floor, please, Henry, Jonathan, or anyone else on the panel.
Let me begin by saying I wrote a little bit about the possibility of what you might call microlateralism in I think the spring issue of foreign policy, a piece on the choices that face Europe. I think this is the easiest choice for Europe in that this is the one that springs most naturally from its instincts and the way in which it has used multilateralism, and it's also in its internal market process of integration in the past to spur each other. But I think that it's a very, very hard policy to really pursue on a large scale unless you have one of the major other powers being willing to buy into it. And the extent to which that is likely to happen, given the given the presentations we've just heard about China going it alone, and given the United States approach, maybe the United States will partly re-engage, maybe not. And the other thing that I would add, I thought Jonathan's presentation was very interesting. One thing I would say is that the conversation that I'm hearing around Washington, D.C. about U.S. extraterritorial power is something like the following. And I think it raises problems for Europe. They see it, and these are the people who would be around a Biden administration. They look at the last few years and they say, okay, we were a little bit worried that perhaps if we overuse these powers, banks might begin to disappear, Europe might begin to resist more substantially. But we've seen Trump doing the stupidest version of this kind of power grab possible. And the pushback has not been particularly bad. The pushback has not been particularly problematic. So that I think that a lot of people in Washington, D.C. are looking at this and they're thinking, okay, what Trump proves is that you actually can be much more aggressive than we have been in the past, and you can get results. And this has consequences, I think, both for the likely long-term future of multilateralism and also for what the European Union does or does not want to do in terms of strategic autonomy.
Great. Jonathan, you want to add something?
That's that's a good point to come in. That's very helpful, Henry's view from Washington. I think, indeed, I think, I mean, I agree on the alliance of multilateralism that it's something that's very hard to do without one of the big powers. On the extraterritoriality, that's precisely why I would say we can see some movement on this now, and this is exactly the logic I think for Europeans that they are increasingly adopting, is that if we want to incentivize multilateralism and disincentivize unilateralism, there has to be some kind of response that goes beyond instincts, which is a paper tiger, but not more. So I think there will be a point where, and the question is when exactly, but when Europeans will react and will exactly change that perception. The perception that Henry talked about is worrying indeed, and shows that some of the failures of European policy over the last few years with regards to that topic. I feel like there is a difference there's a change underway though. Same on systemic rival. I absolutely agree. There's a, you know, when at the height of the pandemic in April, when because the Netherlands were contemplating a name change of their office in Taiwan, and there was China's Global Times speculated about a possible cut off of medical supplies at the height of the pandemic to Europeans, or to the Netherlands in any case, when following an international arrest warrant and arresting Huawei executive, Canada got punished economically by China, and when there's car terror threats over the 5G network building in Europe, this does change the perception that, about China in Europe quite a bit. So there's an increasing worry. There's a huge interest in multilateralism and in cooperating. But when you think about things like cutting off medical supplies and the threat thereof, then that just inherently changes the perception of how much you can cooperate, and if you don't have to build your own tools to respond to such measures. And that for sure feeds into the systemic rivalry debate, and the question, of course, you know, to what degree is it difficult to keep going this Wandel for Handel approach, to keep adopting the Wandel for Handel approach, this trade for change approach. Has been dropped by quite a few now, and a much more realistic and realistic and cautious view of China is taken hold.
Great. George, you want to add something?
Well, my opinion is that you know, despite the attempts of the current U.S. administration to disentangle these two systems, US and China, they are still both the vital components of a single system, you know, entangled in a web of global supply chains. And although we see the disintegration or disentangling in some domains, I think the complex nature of the technology domain is very important in this process. This is why I think that because of a very, very complex nature of the technology domain, I don't think that it is probable to fully disentangle these two systems. So I still think that the trend we are observing now is temporary, and it will reverse to some extent, but not fully, of course. And as Bob Zoellick was warning against pushing China to creation of Sinocentric separate world, I think the wisdom will prevail. So I think that the open trade and open system of exchange is a very positive global achievement. So I'm an optimist, and I think that we will revert to more open system back, maybe not to a degree what we had before 2008, but there will be some reversal. Now, as to the generally the prospect of the strong global leadership, which is absolutely essential, you know, for re-establishing open system, open economic system globally. As also Dongsheng mentioned, the three potential centers, and he was talking about the triangle. And clearly there are three possible sources of global leadership. And there is well-known Singaporean diplomat, is Ambassador Kausikan, who very well described in his recent article the potential of reestablishing global leadership by one of the three mentioned centers. Unfortunately, America will continue to be the inward-looking and I would say more pragmatic and transactional. I think that China will continue to be mercantilist in the future, and I think European Union unfortunately lacks the military power to have the gravitas that is needed for global leadership. So I think still that temporary, maybe the plurilateral approach will be a solution to the current to the current situation, and reinforcing pumping out all the potential of the regional organizations, and especially we are talking about EU, which is extremely important for Georgia, for example. I think that this plurilateral reinforcement of the regional potential of the regional organizations will be important, but we should not expect the global leadership that we have seen before.
Dongsheng, please.
Yes, I will say a little bit about, I believe it's a very good timing to make a big deal, to have a global real dialogue, not only among the scholars like us, but among the big power governments, especially between United States, China, and European leaderships. So only when the big figures can reach agreements about the basic principles and the basic logic of the 21st century global order, both economically, strategically, and politically. As George just now mentioned, that China may go, continue to be mercantilist. I personally have different observations or prediction. China is not going to be as mercantilist as before. Now, I agree that in the past, China was a very typical export-oriented economy, as what the other East Asian nations did in the past half century. But nowadays, China is expanding its import appetite. And very recently, China is holding, even during the pandemic, China is holding its online and offline together, import exhibition, which means China is encouraging the whole world to export good products to Chinese market. And the Chinese middle class is, by size, it's the largest. And actually China, if we look back on my PPTs, I mentioned a very important figure that China is now as big as the United States, the largest market, consumption market. So in the future, China is no longer export-oriented, but be more balanced. And in the big deal or big negotiation among the big players that I mentioned, I believe China is going to pursue a more balanced economy, no longer trade surplus, but even some trade deficit, I believe. That would be is good for the whole world. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, this is almost 4 o'clock. We need to close, as we will be continuing our program with our next session starting at 5 o'clock on the long-term impact of COVID with a very good group of experts that will be meeting also online at 5 o'clock on behalf of the Hamburg Institute for International Economics and the Reinventing Bretton Woods. I would like to thank all of you for taking the time. I know online is not the same feelings than face-to-face, but I hope that this conversation will be part of whatever we do in the next few months, because multilateralism, based on our name, has been an anchor of what we do. You know, international cooperation is so important, you know, and sometimes I'm wondering this year, the case for international cooperation is so critical when you start to think about how you can manage a pandemic. You look back at the financial crisis of 2008, you know, it was all about crisis prevention and resolution. And I think we need something along the same lines for dealing with health crises. And I hope that the next architect of hopefully thinking about international cooperation will start to think that pandemics are becoming more frequent, like financial crises were very frequent. And we will need to build up the underpinnings and the institutions in order to deal with it, as we might be going to this type of pandemic more in terms of frequency more often. Anyway, thank you so much, and looking forward to seeing you soon again. And we